The outer lobes of the cerebral cortex have a variety of functions related to important landmarks, and we are going to cover those in this video in detail. The frontal lobe contains most of the higher thinking or cognitive functions of the brain. It's used for all of our planning, including planning motor tasks, and those planned motor tasks include things like speech. The frontal lobe is also associated with initiating and inhibiting activity, so choosing to do things or choosing to not do things. Damage to the anterior part of the frontal lobe can have an effect on a person's personality and their motivation to do things like want to get a job and work. Damage to the posterior frontal lobe frequently leads to speech and language disorders, as well as paralysis of limbs or paresis, which is weakness in limbs. The frontal lobe has several important landmarks for our purposes. There is the frontal operculum, or more commonly known as Broca's area, which is a very important region for speech motor planning. The orbital region of the frontal lobe, which is the area above the eyes, is associated with some of those higher cognitive functions like memory, emotion, motor inhibition, and overall intellect. The precentral gyrus, also known as the motor strip, is the place where we initiate all of our voluntary motor movements in the body. And then just anterior to that, the supplementary motor area provides a variety of supplementary functions involved with voluntary motor movements, like coordinating those movements with other processes, and is overall an important part of our motor initiation system. Organization of the motor strip and the supplemental motor area is roughly anatomical, meaning that things that are close to each other in the body are also close to each other in the parts of the brain that control them. However, the organization of these brain structures is called contralateral, meaning the left side of the brain controls muscles on the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls muscles on the left side of the body. And overall, the organization of that motor strip is inverted relative to the body, meaning the superior part of the motor strip controls lower body parts like the legs, and the inferior part of the motor strip covers higher parts of the body like the arms or the head, or the structures in the face that we use for speech articulation. Overall, that's a fairly accurate generalization, but you have to remember that the cortex does fold in at the cerebral longitudinal fissure, so things like control of the lower legs and the feet are actually within this fissure rather than at the very visible top of the brain. Organization of the motor strip is sometimes represented by images like these, where control of different areas is either represented on the image of the brain, like in the smaller upper right image, or is represented by a kind of modified version of the body, as shown in the larger lower left image, which makes it clear that the amount of neural tissue involved in controlling various parts of the body is not necessarily proportional to the size of the body part itself. So neural control for things like the legs and the feet is a relatively small amount of brain compared to how much control is involved in the hand or in the face and some of the structures in the face like the lips and the tongue. Broca's area, found at the inferiormost part of the motor strip, is in the left hemisphere only in most people. It is in the right hemisphere in some people, and it being in the right hemisphere is more likely if a person happens to be left-handed. When we have damage to Broca's area, we get a disorder called Broca's aphasia, where a person produces very non-fluent speech. They have halting speech focused on content words. So they can give like subjects and verbs, they can say people are doing things, but they don't produce fluent sentences with thes and uhs and ins and withs and other small words in there that connect everything together. damage in Broca's area is often found with problems controlling the right side of the body, like the right arm or the right leg. So a lot of times you'll see people coming into the speech clinic that will have a cane in their left hand to help them support the body because the right side of the body is not working so well. Generally speaking, while we talk about some of these disorders in very specific ways, usually brain damage is a little more widespread than that, so we often have a lot of comorbidities that go along with our speech and language disorders, other problems that people have in addition to speech and language problems. Moving on to the temporal lobe, this is our area for auditory reception. So for those of you interested in hearing, this is an important part of the brain. Our auditory information and receptive language processing come in here. There are 3 key landmarks that I'll highlight for this class. The first is Heschel's gyrus, which is Brodmann's area 41. The Brodmann map being a map of the brain where relatively small regions are numbered. You can take a look at that in the book. Since we're not going into that much detail in the neuroanatomy, I didn't cover that in this class. Just posterior and superior to Heschel's gyrus is area 42, where higher order auditory processing of information is. So you can think of this kind of like Heschel's gyrus receiving sort of basic tones at individual frequencies with amplitudes. Area 42 gathering those tones together into more coherent sound objects. And then even more posterior and superior to that is Wernicke's area of the brain, another specially identified area because brain damage here tends to cause problems with spoken language and mostly spoken language reception. Wernicke's area, like Broca's area, is found in the left hemisphere, and the majority of people damage to Wernicke's area gives you Wernicke's aphasia. People with Wernicke's aphasia have problems with comprehension. They produce fluent speech, but sometimes put in nonsense words. So you could connect this to comprehension by the idea that when we talk, we also monitor what we say. So if the wrong word is going to get in there, you sometimes can catch that before you actually produce it. People with Wernicke's aphasia have difficulty with monitoring their own speech. There's also a white matter connection between Broca's area, that fluent speech production area, and Wernicke's area, that speech perception area. That's called the arcuate fasciculus. If there's damage to this, we have a disorder called conduction aphasia, where people are unable to repeat something that was spoken to them. So they may be able to understand speech just fine, they may be able to produce speech just fine, but if you ask them to repeat something that you say, they have trouble doing that. In addition to these, more specific areas where there's damage, a person can also have a more global aphasia where they have a more widespread loss of function, probably associated with broader damage to the brain, covering both Broca's and Wernicke's area and some of the other connections. The parietal lobe of the brain, located in the lateral and superior parts of the brain, is where all of our body sensory information comes in, and that's distinct from our quote-unquote special external senses like our hearing and our vision and our smell. The parietal lobe is also the place where we integrate sensory information from all of the different sensory areas, including both our auditory information and our visual information. And if you think about the location of the parietal lobe, where it's just posterior to the motor strip, so it's connected to the control of the body, it's just anterior and superior to the occipital lobe, where visual information comes in. It's superior to the temporal lobe, where auditory information comes in. It kind of makes sense that the parietal lobe would be a place where information gets integrated. Like the other parts of the brain, the parietal lobe is also contralaterally organized, so sensory information from the right side of the body goes into the left parietal lobe, and from the left side of the body into the right parietal lobe. On the parietal lobe, we have the somatosensory cortex, or post-central gyrus. This is just posterior to the motor strip, and it's organized in the exact same way. So we have contralateral organization, as I mentioned, as well as inverted, where, say, sensory information from the face is in a more inferior part of that that somatosensory cortex, and sensory information from the legs and feet would be in the more superior and potentially infolded into the cerebral longitudinal fissure part of that somatosensory cortex. We also have the more general association areas where visual, auditory, and somatic information are brought together to be understood as a complete picture of our senses of the world outside. In the posterior and inferior part of the parietal lobe, we have the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus, which are important structures involved in reading and writing. And again, that location kind of makes sense. It's where the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe are all right next to each other. So we have visual information from things we read or want to write connected to auditory information about what speech sounds are. The cerebrum also contains the occipital lobe, the most posterior part where visual information comes in. It also has contralateral organization based on visual fields, so stuff over on the left side that you're looking at ends up in the right occipital lobe, and stuff over on the right side that you're looking at ends up on the left occipital lobe. But generally speaking, vision isn't an important part of speech-language pathology, so we spend a little less time on that. There is also the insular lobe that you can't see from the surface. It's right next to the subcortex and hindbrain, which will be topics covered in other videos. And as mentioned in the overview, the insular lobe is involved in more basic body maintenance, things like monitoring blood chemistry, how hydrated you are, your respiration, that sort of thing, and also seems to be connected to emotional responses, maybe related to more basic survival instincts that developed in humans as a species. Here's an example of a basic exam type question. Here I have a interestingly colored image of the brain where things are divided up a little bit differently from what we've seen before. But generally speaking, you should be able to identify that in this view of the brain, we've got, again, the front of the brain, the anterior part of the brain toward the left, the back of the brain toward the right. So this big black arrow pointing at kind of the superior posterior part of the brain is going to be pointed at the parietal lobe. If I move that arrow over to the anterior part, the darkish blue shaded area is part of the frontal lobe, though in this particular image the frontal lobe extends a little bit farther backward, so there's kind of a small pink area that would be Broca's area. There's like a pinkish gray area, that's the supplementary motor area, and then kind of a light purple, that would be the motor cortex, probably, anyway. Different kind of example, just in terms of words for a question. Fissure that separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. That's going to be the lateral sulcus, the one that's most easily visible from the side. And you could review what the other answers to this question are in terms of which lobes they separate, so you can kind of imagine for yourself a variety of exam type questions that you could get from these same sorts of concepts. Last but not least, a slightly more in-depth question maybe. It's at least got a lot more words in it, but ultimately what this question boils down to is, where is Broca's area? Broca's area is a part of the frontal lobe, so that's the correct answer. The challenge for you as a student is to kind of sort through all the words that I give you there and get the upshot of what I'm asking for.